Hi, all. Welcome again to one of our conversations on defending democracy in the digital age. I'm Sherry George with the League of Women Voters of Alaska, and we joined the League of Women Voters of Maine's Digital Democracy Working Group following their outstanding and timely presentation at the 2022 LWVUS National Convention. Over the last 18 months, we've covered topics such as data privacy, combating extremism, keeping kids safe online, discriminatory effects of AI and algorithms, the conundrum of regulation, and most recently, approaching misinformation campaigns by using pre-bunking strategies to get out ahead of online manipulation. Today, we will learn about a real-life example, the nexus of misinformation, AI-generated content, and automated phone contact to dissuade the people of New Hampshire from voting in their January primary election. We have three knowledgeable guests to discuss what happened and the legal challenge that the League of Women Voters of New Hampshire, the League of Women Voters of the United States, and individual New Hampshire voters brought, declaring these actions violating the Voting Rights Act and other state and federal consumer protection laws. We have Liz Tinarelli, who is president of the League of Women Voters of New Hampshire, who will lead off the conversation. Selena Stewart is chief counsel and senior director of advocacy and litigation at the League of Women Voters of the United States. And Courtney Hostetler is senior counsel for Free Speech for People and co-lead counsel for the plaintiffs. Throughout the presentation, please enter your questions into the chat. Once the presentation is completed, we'll be going through all the questions and hopefully we can get to most of them. So Liz, please take it away.
Thank you, Sherry, very much. And thank you all for coming. So as you may know, New Hampshire prides itself on holding the first in the nation presidential primary each year. And this year was a little different. The lead Democrat didn't show up for that. Wanted the primary held elsewhere. But anyway, we went ahead because we have it in statute. That was on January 23rd. And about 2 days before the primary, robocalls started flooding into New Hampshire voters' phones. The robocall sounded like President Biden. And the message that President Biden was giving people was, don't bother voting in this January primary. Save your vote for November when it really counts. Well, you and I know that that makes no sense. It's not something you have only one of and use once and it's gone. But that was the message, and it was Biden's voice. There were somewhere between 5,000 and 25,000 of these calls placed in New Hampshire as a robocall. And it used phrasing from President Biden. It said something about a bunch of malarkey. That's a phrase we've heard him use, isn't it? Well, it turns out this was an AI-generated message. President Biden never said any of that. Not only that, the phone call was spoofed to look like it was coming from the person who used to chair the Democratic Party in New Hampshire. So if you had caller ID, you might recognize the name on the caller ID. In addition, the message gave her cell phone number as somebody to call if you had more questions. And yes, she got calls. So this was all an event that was triggered by a man named Steve Kramer. Now, he's a political operative. He's out of New York. He's worked for a number of companies, or campaigns rather, over the years. He was not doing this for a particular campaign. He maintains he did this in order to awaken the public to the danger of AI-generated material that could deceive voters. What happened as a result of this is that the League of Women Voters of New Hampshire the League of Women Voters of US and some individuals, two of whom are league members who got the calls, are suing Mr. Kramer, who originated the plot, if we want to call it that, and the company that actually made the robocalls. The person who created the message itself, interesting story, sort of an out-of-work street magician. Mr. Kramer found him and knew that he could play with AI, and he got him for $150 to create this phone message. So that guy had no idea what it was going to be used for. He was just happy to get his $150, apparently. So that he is not part of the lawsuit. But what we are trying to do, of course, is to prevent this from happening again by bringing suit. And Courtney can talk more about that. But that's basically what happened in New Hampshire. Anywhere between 5,000 and 25,000 people were discouraged from voting in our presidential primary, supposedly by President Biden. Robocall generated voice. So I'll turn it over to Courtney.
Hi, Liz. Thank you so much for that explanation of what happened in New Hampshire, and of course, for everything you're doing to try to protect New Hampshire voters from this happening again. And thank you, everyone, for having me here today. So as Liz has just shared, these robocalls were recorded and disseminated in very short period of time, right? Just over one day, reached thousands of voters in the span of a few hours, just days before the primary. AI technology was coupled with broadcasting technology to deceive voters with a false message that appeared and sounded as if it was being conveyed not just by a credible source, but from the credible source, right? From the President of the United States. And the message and the threat within that message was very clear, right? If you vote in the primaries, you lose the right to vote in the general election. That's a scary message, especially for many voters who might not be as familiar with the ins and outs of voting, who might be thinking about voting for the first time, who might be returning to voting from a long time away. And as we know, this technology is new and it's capable of being deployed very quickly. And that's scary for all of us. But as voters and as advocates for the right to vote, we're not without recourse. Now, some of this means that, unfortunately, organizations like the League of Women Voters are having to divert their limited resources to the rapid response necessary to correct disinformation and voter intimidation when it happens, because it is happening and it's happening quickly. But luckily, also, there's already some laws on the books that can protect voters before the intimidation happens, or at least in this case, hopefully before it happens again. And that's exactly what the lawsuit is attempting to do here. So the US League of Women Voters and the New Hampshire League of Women Voters have sued the parties responsible for orchestrating and for disseminating these deep-faked robocalls under the spoofed phone number. And it asserts several causes of action, federal and state. Now, the first claim is a Voting Rights Act claim. Section 11B of the Voting Rights Act and powerful tool for challenging voter intimidation. It prohibits intimidation, threats, and coercion that would either stop someone from voting or would change how they vote. And it prohibits the attempted intimidation as well. Just because the attempt doesn't succeed, maybe the person votes anyway, maybe they realize what the threat is or that it's not a real threat, doesn't render that attempt, doesn't render the intimidation, the threat, or the coercion lawful. And we saw that intimidation and the threats here, right? This is a different form of intimidation, right? I think we're used to thinking about it as guns at the polling places, but unfortunately, we're seeing an evolution in how parties are trying to stop people from going to the polls. And this deep fake recording attempted to convince voters not to vote in the primary election via a threat to their ability to vote in the general election. And it used deep fake and spoofing technology to create unearned legitimacy for the call, just as Liz explained. And look, the Voting Rights Act is 60 years old. It was written before AI. It was written before spoofing existed. It was written before deep fake existed. but it was not written before voter intimidation existed. And the drafters understood that unfortunately there's going to be different ways that intimidation and threats and coercion happen. They wrote it to be a broadly interpreted statute. That's how it's been interpreted. It was intended to empower organizations, private citizens to use it to protect voters regardless of the means, or in this case, the technology used. But it's not actually the only law that we were able to bring a claim under. There's other federal and state laws. There's the Telephone Consumer Protection Act, which is a federal law. It prohibits any person from initiating artificial or pre-recorded calls, like these robocalls, without the express consent of the called party. There's some exceptions that are not relevant here. And it also requires entities to disclose who's responsible for the call and to provide an accurate opt-out option. And that, of course, did not happen here. Steve Kramer and the companies that disseminated the calls did not disclose the entity responsible, and in fact directed those recipients of the calls, if they wanted to opt out, to actually call a number that not only wasn't associated with the calls, but provided that false legitimacy, that tried to earn credibility. Oh, this is a name that you recognize. This is a number you recognize. And it's from somebody who might very well be involved in a voter education platform. Of course, that's not what this is. This was disinformation, and the person who received these opt-out calls had absolutely no idea what was going on. So that's the federal piece of it. And then there's also some state laws in New Hampshire that New Hampshire has moved fairly quickly to get in front of some of the abuse of these pre-recorded political messages. They have laws that require, again, that calls identify the name of the candidate or the organization that the call is being made on behalf of, as well as who paid for it. That didn't happen here. And it also, importantly, New Hampshire law prohibits any person from knowingly misrepresenting the origin of the political phone call. Again, didn't happen here. Intentionally obfuscated that this call was coming from Steve Kramer. It spoofed the phone number of the former New Hampshire Democratic Party chair. That was also the phone number associated with the so-called opt-out, which was not opting out because she had no idea what was going on. And then, of course, it used deep fake technology to make it sound as if the recording was from President Biden, right? So intentional obfuscation of who these calls were from. These are really critical laws that are in place and that will hopefully provide grounds to get an injunction to stop this from happening again. Now, it's worth noting, you may have seen in the news, it's been a rapidly evolving situation. There are now pending criminal charges against Steve Kramer, who orchestrated the calls. And then the Federal Communications Commission has proposed enforcement actions and multi-million-dollar fines against both Kramer and Lingo Telecom, which is the company that transmitted the calls and improperly labeled them in such a way that limited providers' ability to recognize these calls as being spoofed. That being said, it's important to recognize that these private causes of action are still incredibly important for a variety of reasons, but not least of which because these indictments and the actions are looking backwards, right? They punish violations, but our lawsuit recognizes that these same actors could do this again. I'm sorry, I just saw a reference and I apologize. A private cause of action would be an action brought by somebody other than the state, right? So League of Women Voters is an entity. They are bringing a lawsuit. They're not associated with the Department of Justice. They are not associated with, the DA. This is a private citizen or a private group that has a right to say, hey, our rights are being violated here. So I apologize. Thank you for that question. And so one of the things that this lawsuit can do is seek an injunction saying, look, these people pose a real risk to our democracy. They've already violated these incredibly important laws and they can do it again. And if they do it again, there's no money damages that can protect voters, right? Once people give up the right to vote, if they do this again and they succeed in frightening people from voting, in convincing people they don't have the right to vote, that's it. That's gone. Right? You can't get money damages back for having given up your right to vote. And that is why it's important that the lawsuit that the League of Women Voters has brought is so important, and is important even when there's other actions by federal agencies or by New Hampshire district attorneys. And I would also just say that, hopefully these laws demonstrate why we need kind of a network of laws here, right? They demonstrate why, on the one hand, we need laws that direct, get at the technology head on, right? That ask our legislators to stay up to speed in these ever-changing technology, particularly when it has the power to harm, to misinform, to intimidate. But then it also demonstrates why it's important to have enduring laws on the books, like the Voting Rights Act, that are written in such a manner that they protect voters and the franchise, even as the means of suppressing and intimidating voters, even as those means evolve. And so we have these laws. I think there's work to be done on both fronts. And now that I've laid out the groundwork for the hard work, I'm going to hand it over to Selena to tackle that.
Thank you, Courtney. Hello, fellow leaguers. How's everybody doing tonight? I know it's early evening here and as well as Maine. So yeah, clearly what happened in New Hampshire goes beyond just New Hampshire, which is why the league decided. So the national office joined the League of New Hampshire in filing this case because we knew that this has broader impact and that it could have impact. And the dangerousness of this is just what Courtney and Liz have already said, which is it happens so quickly and it reaches so many people that you're limited in what we can do to fix things when things go wrong in this particular manner. So I know that some people are aware that Congress is not as busy in some places, but they are actually doing some work around artificial intelligence, particularly in the Senate. So there's 3 bills that we are keeping an eye on here. The first is Protect Elections from Deceptive Artificial Intelligence Act. That's in the Senate, and it restricts candidates and groups connected to candidates from using deceptive AI in election communications. The text is very similar to the FEC petition that Courtney, I think, mentioned just a moment ago. And then the second is AI Transparency in Elections Act of 2024. So that is something that happened just earlier this year. It requires the use of disclaimers if AI is used in an election communication by any entity. So a bit broader than that first one. And we have supported these 2 bills in particular, but then there's another one that we are watching as well, which is the Preparing Election Administrators for AI Act, which creates voluntary guidelines for election administrators. So we chose not to endorse this after some conversations with Senator Klobuchar's office, particularly because of because there's some questions about how the report will be funded. And we think that could be not so good for the American folks and also voters, although we have been having conversations with her and we think that this bill could come to the floor at some point. So we'll continue to watch that. The other thing I want to mention is last year, Biden did an executive order around this, and that was called the Safe and Secure and Trustworthiness of Development and Use of AI. So Biden has also done an executive order to help equip some of the agencies who may oversee this, like DOJ, like agencies who are involved in doing voter registration, if, for example, their technology is compromised in some way. And so both at the administrative level and also the legislative level, this is definitely part of a larger conversation happening. And again, we are watching these things, and as these things progress and move forward, we'll definitely be thinking about ways to engage should we think it's going to be helpful to voters and our work generally. So I think I will leave it at that, short and sweet. I saw lots of questions in the chat, so I'm not sure if you all want to handle questions.
I wanted to address one of the questions is, how did we find out Steve Kramer and Lingo Telecom and so on? Our Attorney General found it out very quickly. I don't know how, but it was in the news the night before the election and all during the day of the election. So he did his best to mitigate the effects of the robocalls. by publicizing the fact that they had been made, that they were false, that indeed you could vote and vote. You know, he told the truth, in other words, and said these were false calls, ignore them. Now, you know, what I see as league duty was the same thing. So I was ill, unfortunately. I couldn't be in the office answering the telephone, but I was answering calls remotely every hour in case there were any with people who had gotten the calls and wondered, should we vote? So that's what I'm seeing as league having to be able to respond very quickly to some of these bad things that are going on. And it's just something we're going to have to do. Just within the last week, Steve Kramer was indicted by the Attorney General of New Hampshire on 13 felony counts of voter suppression and 13 misdemeanor counts of impersonation of a candidate. So that, you know, the charges are different in each of these cases. And Mr. Kramer keeps insisting, throw it at me, whatever happens is fine. I wanted to make my point. You can decide for yourself whether you want to believe that or not. But, you know, he's having the book thrown at him along with a possible $6 million fine from the FCC. All right, what else do we have to address?
This is Sherry. One question, I think both you and Courtney mentioned the FCC's recent, I guess it's a ruling, I don't know exactly what you call it, but does that affect at all the case that you all are bringing, or is it just sort of another one that he has to deal with, but it doesn't necessarily affect your case?
I'll let our lawyer answer that.
It's the latter. So the FCC bringing this enforcement action does not stop our case. And as mentioned, there's really two different goals, right? The FCC has identified some significant fines based on the violations by Kramer and by Lingo Telecom. We are also obviously deeply concerned with what they've done, but a big piece of that is what they're going to do, right? These are parties who have demonstrated they need very little time, very little resources to reach thousands of voters immediately before an election. The goal of this lawsuit is to seek that injunction. We're asking the court to block these parties from engaging in this sort of deceptive robocall dissemination again, right? But not to block them before the next election and to block them moving forward, because we recognize how quickly this can happen. And once it happens, right? I mean, Liz, you mentioned, you know, thousands and thousands of voters were reached. I think New Hampshire, the League of Women Voters did amazing jobs trying to reach people quickly to explain that this was false. But the reality is nobody knows how many thousands of people didn't learn that this was false. How many thousands of people maybe were afraid to go vote in the primaries. And we also, as the technology evolves, if this happens again, whether or not people will learn of the deception before they've given up their right to vote, right? So it's really important that this lawsuit is happening at the same time. It's a separate issue altogether.
Okay, thank you. I see one that was a question that was posed, I think, when you were speaking, Courtney, and it says, is the law the same one under which Steve Kramer is being indicted by the state of New Hampshire? And was there a campaign finance violation in addition to all the other things that people are finding?
So I'll tackle the first one. Similar, but not the same. So the laws that the state New Hampshire laws relevant to our lawsuit are laws that allow a civil suit to be brought. There are a number of other criminal laws in New Hampshire that identify the same behavior as unlawful and allow criminal criminal indictments to be brought. Very similar, but there's a different goal, right? And then in terms of a campaign finance violation, we don't know. Kramer is asserting that although he had been hired by a campaign, that he did not do this as part of a campaign, that he did this independently. If that, so the question is, we really don't know if there was a campaign finance violation. If this was done at the behest of a campaign or on behalf of a campaign, and this is not reported, there would obviously be issues. But right now, that has not been, the focus has been on the dissemination of these deceptive calls. And right now, Kramer is asserting that he did it without being associated with a campaign.
So
Another one.
I see questions about, is the lawsuit a deterrent? What if another bad actor tries to do the same thing? That's exactly why we're bringing suit, to try to discourage that. You've had a program on pre-bunking. It's similar to that. We're trying to take proactive steps ahead of time so that this doesn't happen again. We all know it very well might. That people will do what they want to do. And the fact that this could be generated by some guy, and he said it took him less than 30 minutes to create the call. He got paid $150 and went away and had a nice dinner in a hotel room that night, apparently. So, that we realize this could be done by almost anyone at any time. And that's why the suit is going on, to try to send a warning, really, and discourage them.
And we should expect this as the league, right? One thing we know about ourselves is that we are the watchers, right? We see so many of the things happening, but because of how quickly this happened and how widespread it was, we should be looking for this, because it could be a really effective tool to suppress the vote if not accounted for or not having some repercussions. So one of the things that we've been talking about here is, I think Liz and the team in New Hampshire, the news was certainly helpful. And I also think that people turn to the league to say, hey, is this right? Most people are going to know it's not. Something's not right about a presidential candidate saying don't vote. But there's so many people who may be new to the franchise, or just unaware, because it sounds so much like the person who's speaking. And so I think that's where the league can really fill in the gap and just providing accurate information. And one of the things we're doing at the national office is leveraging Vote for 1-1. And so if we hear from states that a robocall has happened, we will have an alert on Vote for 1-1 that says an active robocall is in your state, please continue to vote, etc. Just so we can do our part on the tech side to get the message out as quickly as possible to people.
Sort of as a follow-on to that, comments you just made, Selena. So there's a question here, and I actually this is my own question. It's slightly worded differently, but pretty close. So if the same thing happened in another state, would we have the same protections as New Hampshire? And are there some other state laws that are better? But my follow-on to that was, if something like this happens, what should we do as, at the local or the state or the federal level? What should we do as league members? Should we be talking to League US, to folks like you, Selena, or are we supposed to handle it on our own? What's the process there?
So two things, as Courtney mentioned, there are federal laws that are part of this lawsuit, and there are state laws. And so I think on the state front, that's going to come down to the particular state and what laws apply. But the federal laws will apply to all the states regardless, right? The second piece of that is, in terms of what to do, one of the things that we have started, I don't know if folks are aware, but we have the league has an internal crisis scenario election group, 16 states that get together and talk about what crisis scenarios could come up. And so as part of that, the state league leaders around the country are working on the communications rapid response plan. So if you have not heard from your state delegation, you should somewhat soon to figure out who is the point person for your local league in terms of being a spokesperson with the local media, who is your comms person, if something comes up or if there's media requests. And so if you all will probably start getting that outreach from your state president and state ED pretty soon to fill that out. So you should use that communication protocol to submit to the state. And then we have a person who's assigned to every state leader to filter that information up. And so if we do think that a situation is brewing or that it has grown to the point where we need to file a lawsuit, then we will be calling our good friends at Free Speech for the People to help us in that particular state. So I would say look out for those communication protocols that are coming from your state president or ED. Fill that out, who the right person is, because what we don't want to do is not be sure who to contact in the state to get that information, because that leads to, identifying people who may have been impacted and a whole host of things that could be helpful should we need to file something. Courtney, what did I say? Correct me if I'm wrong. Tell me what I missed.
No, you missed nothing. I have nothing to add to that.
Okay.
I want to point out that as a result of the robocalls, very quickly legislation was filed in New Hampshire and 2 bills have been passed that get very explicit about robocalls and AI impersonation. One of them even says that any lobbyist who sinks to that level and uses it will have his license to be a lobbyist removed. I mean, so we've got anger in the state, and I think those bills will be signed by the governor. They've passed the legislature. Any state, I suppose, has some laws. My husband keeps nagging me and saying, but why are you focused on AI? Because you could have an actor impersonating President Biden and doing the same thing that happened in New Hampshire. And that it is against the law to impersonate somebody else for a nefarious motive, perhaps. I don't quite know what the law says. So while I think we're very concerned with AI because of how quickly and effectively these kinds of deep fakes can be created, whether they're visual or on the phone, oral, we should be aware of the fact that robocalls can sound like it's coming from anywhere. And that's the problem for us.
And not the SNL parodies, because
No.
obviously
The law
they impersonate people all
specifically
the time.
says that, yeah.
Right.
That we're passing. It says it's okay to have a TV parody. It's funny.
Right.
Sherry, are there other?
Yes, yeah, I saw. Thank you.
Okay.
Here's one that goes a little beyond our borders, but a question: is there anything out there that would prevent other countries from using these capabilities? We can sue individuals in the U.S., but what about protections against other people in other countries? Can we go to the applications like Facebook, Google, etc., and sue them?
Courtney, do you have, I don't know if you're aware of like the Facebook conversations and IG. I don't know if you want to share some of that.
Sure. So you're right to recognize that it gets complicated when we're talking about messages that are being disseminated from outside the United States, but also messages that are being disseminated via social media as opposed to the calls. And this is where I think it's important, to think about ways in which our legislatures at the federal and state level need to be able to catch up with technology and what technology is doing and how massive numbers of voters are being reached. And unfortunately, that the mechanisms that can help educate voters, that can provide them with critically important information, can be undermined, can be utilized to misinform voters, to intimidate voters, to tell them that they in fact don't have the right to vote, or they would have to choose between voting in the primaries or the general, right? And so unfortunately, I don't know, especially when it comes to the use of social media, there's a lot of work to be done at the legislature, at, you know, at that level, to provide the same kind of protections that we have when it comes to the dissemination of calls via telephones, right? And so I think there's some work to be done there, and there's some really interesting conversations to be had about how to use and protect, you know, make sure that people have access to important means of communication, but also protected when those means are undermined, which is a terrible non-answer, and I apologize. But again, it goes to that point of we have some work to do as advocates for the kind of laws that we need in this ever-changing world. And I don't want to go too far afield, so.
I would just say, do you all remember following the 2020 election, how Facebook was called by congressional committees to answer for not catching certain things, not disabling, shutting down people's accounts when there was misinformation. So I definitely think that because of that, there has been some efforts. I know on Facebook's and IG, I'm not in any way trying to say they are perfect and that they are going to get this 100% right. But I know that there has been public pressure. And in particular, I met a gentleman from Latinos Unidos at a hearing, or I'm sorry, a convening a couple of weeks ago, and they are pushing really hard to ensure that political messages with mis and disinformation are not targeting their community. And so I think that there's a lot of people taking a bite at the apple, but there's, like Courtney said, a lot more work that has to be done to make sure that there is a cohesive and unified rules around what people can and cannot do on social media.
This question from Heidi, and it also addresses to some extent the one posed by Elaine just before. What efforts are being made to offer pre-bunking public service announcements, PSAs, in all media and social media nationwide? Is there a campaign for this for all kinds of threats? And it sort of follows on to the question that Elaine had posed, where she notes that putting information in 411 is great, but someone has to recognize the risk and take the initiative to go there to get the information. So it's that takes some effort on a person's part and to know there's 411. And the second question was a little more generic about, is League undertaking some efforts to create pre-bunking PSAs that maybe we could all use?
So yes and yes. So just for folks on this call's info, so we run reports on Vote for 111 pretty frequently on a regular basis, but particularly around election. For 2016 and 2020, now obviously there's lots of elections in between, but when we compare 2016 and 2020, we had traffic up around 8 to 10 million people on election day checking Vote for 111. So we don't want to miss that opportunity to reach people who may be checking, understanding that we're not going to capture everyone. But also we understand that when people see that on Vote for 111, they tend to share it. And so hopefully even beyond the hits that we have on the website, it's going beyond that with sharing information about sharing accurate information. And two, the League we are definitely doing some national messaging. The comms team is working with the election task force internal, the LWVUS one, to create mitigation and inoculation messaging. And that will be coming out to leagues this summer. The goal is, I think, July for that, but that's being vetted by the election task force, like I said, by LWVUS. But yeah, we want to make sure we're singing from the same sheet of music. And so we want to make sure that that pre-mitigation messaging and the inoculation messaging is consistent. So no matter where it's happening, that we're all kind of saying the same thing in terms of how to tap it down and not allow it to spread in a harmful fashion.
One thing that I worry about with AI or some other way of doing this is that somebody could be impersonating the Secretary of State or election officials and say, due to a state emergency, we're closing the polls early. Polls will all close at 5, and then people are not going to go. So what I do with the league's phone, the office phone and the website, is have the front page of the website and the phone message say something like, here's the Attorney General, the State Attorney General's emergency hotline. If you have any questions about elections, call immediately. And that's staff all leading up to the election and all during election day. So I think that, as state and local leagues, anything we can do to get out that kind of local trusted phone number for people to call if something should come up. And then the Attorney General will be aware of it right away, which is one good thing. But also they can get the correct information. No, the polls are not closing at 5 p.m. You can still go and vote. So that's part of that preparedness that Selena talked about. We have to have these emergency plans.
And if many of you may be plugged into your local and state election protection, you should still be leveraging those, on election day if things come up, especially messages like poll closures, consolidations, etc., because they have attorneys about, I think at last count it was 11,000 attorneys on the ground for election day planned to help with those type of issues that come up on election day. So just don't forget about the 1-866 vote too.
So this question here towards the end said, what could we be doing in our own state to get out ahead of this? So Liz has talked about some things, and so did you, Selena, that we could do. And but the second part is among the league's pro-democracy allies, at least when I've been to the U.S. convention, we have many, many allies that I didn't realize until going to the convention, as long as the ones that we all would imagine are allies of League. But among these pro-democracy allies, is there a consensus about needed actions or reforms? Do you talk about this across the allied front?
Yeah, so in the pro-democracy space, we have been doing scenario planning for about a year and some change. Courtney's probably plugged into some of these. I've been plugged into these, but there are 3 or 4 groups, legal groups, advocacy groups, even agencies who are working with groups like us to think through what could the issues be, what's the most appropriate lane for us based on who it is, whether it's an agency, whether it's another pro-democracy group, whether it's our attorney friends who may need to support us on the ground if something happens. But yeah, so there has been, I say that because there's been so many scenarios. There's so many scenarios that we are planning for. But of course, out of all those scenarios, there's going to be some key sets that really apply to the league and where we can make an impact. And so we're thinking through, we have already thought through what the league scenarios are. There's about 12 of them. And again, that mitigation and inoculation messaging that we are building go specifically to the things, the value add that we think we are going to add for election day. And so again, if those issues come up, you all will have preset language to push out and to be saying should an issue come up in your community.
Okay, that's good to hear. I guess you have a lot to filter through, huh? With all the groups and all the scenarios, and
sorry,
I think we could each come up with our own local example of how do I deal with this one. So this goes back a little bit in the question line, but what are the New Hampshire laws? I guess this perhaps is a Courtney question. What are the New Hampshire laws that are being brought to bear? I know you covered this, but I'd like to underscore it so that we could keep that in mind.
Sure. So the causes of action in our case, we're looking at RSA 664, 14A, and 14B. Right. So these are the civil claims that we have brought And that's what I discussed earlier. And then, of course, there's the criminal cases that have been brought. And Steve Kramer has been charged with a number of counts looking at, so if you're looking for the exact laws, you would look up RSA 659 colon 40, and then also misdemeanor counts related to impersonating a candidate, as I believe Selena mentioned earlier, and that would be RSA 666 colon 7A. So those are some of the laws that you might want to look out if you're kind of looking at the exact language of his violations, both the criminal violations and then the civil violations that are relevant to our lawsuit.
So the last question goes, wait, what? Where are those laws? This
So
looks like
No, I'll just come off mute and say that was me, and I put those questions in, and I got that those were the actual statutory citations, but maybe you could say like impersonating a candidate is illegal, or what the laws actually prohibit.
Sure. I thought that you were actually asking for the exact language of the laws. So when it comes,
not to say I may not go look them up. I'm just saying.
That's totally fair. I thought that's what the goal of the question was. I apologize. Sure. So for our claims, right, there is a law that says that all pre-recorded political messages, like this one, has to identify the name of the candidate or the organization that the call is being made on behalf of, and it has to identify who paid for it. That did not happen here. And then the other civil claim is that, and this is a really important one, it prohibits anyone from knowingly misrepresenting the origin of the political phone call. And that happened here in two ways, right? So first, it spoofed the number of the former New Hampshire Democratic Party chair. And then it also included her name and number as the so-called opt-out option, when she had absolutely no idea what was going on and had no authority to opt out anybody. And then it also, so that's one way that that spoofing masked and misrepresented the origin of the call. But then it also used the deep fake technology to make it sound as if the call were originating from President Biden. It sounded like him, it used his language. So both those pieces together demonstrated a real issue with the misrepresentation. And then the criminal case is looking at voter suppression. And so that theory is more like our Voting Rights Act theory, right? That this is intended to suppress the vote, to intimidate voters. And then there's another law. And so that's that first one I talked about. And then there's another law that has to do with the impersonation of a candidate. So those are sort of two buckets, but there's a number of charges pending under those two buckets in the criminal cases.
is that good, Ann?
Yeah, good. I got it. Thank you so much. And I'm not sure Maine has all of those, so I'm going to, run a little checklist here.
One of the new bills that's coming up in New Hampshire requires that the origin of the ad, so this could be on Facebook, it could be on TV, whatever it is, be in large enough print and be on the screen long enough that you can actually figure out who is paying for this. So, I think we've all gotten a little bit annoyed with that. It says paid for by blah, 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 and you have no idea who that is. So that was an outcome of this incident.
See, the last question that's been posed so far is there any effort to provide election protection representatives, I guess that's what it means, that can help notify people already at the polls in case some warning needs to be conveyed to those at the polls, especially if there's some form of electronic interference at the polls? Are there any dress rehearsals for these different scenarios?
Yeah, so this comes up in a few ways. So the observers, there are often election observers. Many of you may be doing that on election day. So the observers usually are are around and communicating, and they are the ones who are either communicating with EP or EP is on site with that elevating into the national hotline in place like that. So it does tend to get out pretty quickly because there are observers on site at so many locations. And in terms of dress rehearsals, the primaries are the dress rehearsal. We would not have known about this issue had it not come up during the primary in New Hampshire. And so we have been keeping, at least at the national office, a keen eye on the primaries and talking with those states to make sure that we can be aware of anything like this, anything that's going to suppress the vote or could suppress the vote as primaries are happening. And so we've been using the primaries as the dress rehearsal to see what could come up.
Okay, thank you, Selena. I'm glad to hear that. In our local area, I know they've been having the poll worker training, of course, and these kind of scenarios have come up in that training. So I won't say they were dress rehearsals. They were discussion about how this could happen and some things to do about it, but not really practicing. It's sort of a different thing.
Was it the AI scenario, or was there another scenario that's worth mentioning?
No, more along the lines of if something happens and poll workers need to know about it, that say a message has gone out, like the robocall, and the poll workers need to know that has happened so that if people come in, they do. And we live in kind of small areas, so everybody knows everybody, and so they're always chatting. Did you hear about, I got this robocall from President Biden, or this call from President Biden, and he said X. So how to kind of deal with that possibility if it happens actually at the polls, people asking questions. One question I had is, so these suits are pending. Do you have some idea of the timing? I'm thinking that if something happened in a timely way where we could all use the results of whatever lawsuits, injunctions, whatever are going on in our own, let's say, letters to the editor or opinion pieces talking about this phenomenon. Is there any chance that we'll have an answer on any of these cases, so that might be useful for people?
We have sought a preliminary injunction in this case, which is basically when we tell the court, we have a strong case, we're going to win, and if you don't stop them from doing it right now, they're going to cause harm before we get to trial, and we're not going to be able to mitigate this harm. And that's exactly what we're looking at here, right? Cases often take a long time to get to trial, and it is very possible, very likely, this case is not going to trial before the election, before the general election in the fall. And if we don't get this preliminary injunction, any of these parties could run a similar campaign the day before the election and cause the kind of mass chaos that we'd be concerned about. So that's exactly why we're seeking a preliminary injunction in this case. Now, it would apply only to the defendants in this case, but hopefully by bringing this case, by getting a decision on our motion for preliminary injunction, asking that court to block them from doing it again, there would be a decision that could be useful if anybody, that either it deters other actors from doing it at all, or if it does happen, if somebody else does try something like this, having a decision like this might enable other potential state chapters of the League of Women Voters to move swiftly to seek a preliminary injunction quickly. Another court might be willing to act very fast because the district court in New Hampshire has issued a decision, has weighed in on the law here. So that is a way, even though the injunction would only apply to the defense in this case, the ruling could be beneficial and useful if any other party tries to use AI technology and deepfake technology to intimidate or threaten voters. The state law piece of it obviously applies here, but there's those federal claims as well. And hopefully you will find parallel laws in your own states.
Right.
And that's something that might be worth looking into in the next few months so that it's, at your fingertips. Hopefully you never need to use it. But if you do, it might be useful to see if your state has something similar. And if not, to start advocating for your legislators.
Yeah, I think
Yeah,
the other thing is, when we have election issues like this, courts have to handle it very quickly because all of these other deadlines come up, certifying the election, sending it to the House of Representatives, all have back channels, right? And so if we don't resolve this early, then it could create a backlog and a lot of pressure on judges, particularly who may have to handle these claims on election day in a very tight time frame. So I think sending the message to the importance of handling, and I think judges get that. They understand what that looks like, but also just, making sure we share that message so that we can encourage a decision as quickly as possible so that it doesn't create an administrative issue nightmare on election day.
Yeah, these last comments are super useful. I can certainly see how if the injunction is granted, any of us could potentially use it as an example of, even if the case has not come to the court. Yes, and looking at our state laws will be very critical. And I can say right now for Alaska's laws, I don't know exactly which ones would apply, so I will put that on my to-do list. But I think we're getting kind of close to the end. So unless there's one more question, I think we've gotten them all, hit them all. I would like to thank all of you who are listening and who've been asking questions for joining us tonight, and to Liz and Selena and Courtney for giving us the lowdown on what happened and the legal challenge to protect voters. And so I guess pleased and sort of honored that you all have taken this on for the rest of us. And it's really an important thing. I'm very glad that you jumped in, the leagues jumped in, and we've got such good legal counsel helping us. So a recording of today's conversation will be posted to the League of Women Voters in Maine's website soon, probably in the next couple days. The recordings of almost all of our earlier speakers are also posted there, and we'd ask you to share this resource with your members and anyone else who you think might be interested in this, allied groups and so on. If you'd like to help us keep the series going, we'd like you to consider a small donation to our tip jar that's on the League of Women Voters Maine website. And you can note the digital democracy and that how should this donation be used box. Stay tuned for our next gathering of Let's Talk About Digital Threats to Democracy, planned for June 25th. We'll be featuring Gauri Ramachandran from the Brennan Center, talking about intimidations and threats against both elected and appointed election officials, as well as how to combat threats against poll workers. So we hope you'll be joining with us to hear her presentation on that. And we thank you again for joining our guests and the League of Maine and Alaska today. So bye for now, and until next time.